We're excited for this next discussion as we preview the Summit of the Americas, which is taking place just within the next few weeks. And to moderate this next discussion is the director of the Kimberly Green Latin American Caribbean Center and former president of Costa Rica, President Luis Guillermo Solis.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, is Debbie Mucarsel-Powell. She is the special advisor for the 2022 Summit of the Americas. She's the first South American-born member of Congress and was over 20 years of experience providing strategic policy, fiscal, fundraising, and operational leadership in both the public and nonprofit sector. She's a national leader with a proven track record of success in nonprofits, higher education, and Congress. She was one of our own. She worked here at FIU, as Provost Behar said. So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce the special advisor for the 2022 Summit of the Americas, Debbie Mucarsel-Powell.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
She's going to present with her remarks, and then we will follow, as we did before, a conversation with me and with the public. Thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be back here, one of my homes here in Miami, FIU. I spent so many years working at first at the College of Health and then at the College of Medicine. Thank you for inviting me to discuss President Biden's vision for the upcoming Summit of the Americas, which will be hosted in the United States in Los Angeles this June. I want to thank Florida International University and the Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy, the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, and especially to Assistant Director for Research and Strategic Initiatives, Randy Pestana, for organizing this year's Hemispheric Security Conference. Thank you. Thank you, President Solis, for moderating today's session. I had the honor of participating in another Summit of the Americas focused event alongside President Solis just last week. We really appreciate all the work that President Solis and the FIU community is doing in gathering key regional stakeholders to hold these type of informational exchanges and discussions in advance of the Summit of the Americas. These conversations are going to better prepare us to welcome the Americas to Los Angeles this June and to engage in some of the most pressing issues that are affecting our region today. Many of you may have heard of me as the former Congresswoman for Florida's 26th District, but it's been over a month now that I have been honored to answer the call to serve as special advisor to the summit. And you can imagine, as someone that was born in Ecuador, that was the first South American to be elected to Congress, this is an issue that's very close to my heart, and it speaks directly to me. I have been traveling to different cities and speaking with different groups of Americans regarding the summit and what this means to Americans here at home. Just last week, I was in Denver, but today, of course, it's nice to be home here in Miami with my family and with all of you. The United States is truly honored to be able to host for the second time the 9th Summit of the Americas. And this is President Biden's priority event for the region. I'm sure, and I hope, that everyone is just as excited as I am to host the summit. It's the first time that we've done it since 1994. This is a summit that occurs every 3 to 4 years. It really brings together heads of state, government representatives from all over the region, Canada, Central America, Caribbean, and South America. It also brings together members of civil society, youth leaders, entrepreneurs. And our hosting the summit really demonstrates the United States' deep commitment to the people of the Western Hemisphere. And President Biden has made it clear that he wants this to be the most inclusive summit today. Through the process of the summit, our region's leaders create political commitments that are going to work on improving the lives of the people of the region. While most of the summit won't speak explicitly about security, all of the commitments that the summit will address are directly linked to the many facets of hemispheric security challenges that you will examine at this conference over the next couple of days. Part of my role as the White House Special Advisor is to hear from stakeholders throughout the hemisphere. I've already heard and had many conversations with members of civil society, entrepreneurs, young people, and all of those who are invested in the summit. But today I need to hear from the people in this room, from thought leaders, members of academia, senior military officials, and leaders of the security industry with connections to both the United States and across the region. The leaders that are gathering at the summit have the opportunity and the obligation to commit concrete actions to build better lives for the people. The pandemic, as you can imagine, the accelerating climate crisis, violence and insecurity, corruption, declining trust in government, all contribute to historic migration flows across the Americas, among other challenges. The theme for the summit this year is building a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future. The theme responds to the challenges that we face with COVID-19, the pandemic, how it's exposed, and the cracks that it has exposed in health, in the economic systems, educational and social systems, the threats that we're all facing to democracy and democratic institutions, the climate crisis, and a lack of equitable access to economic, social, and political opportunities. We have to discuss how we are going to strengthen democratic governments. How are we going to learn from those lessons that the pandemic has left behind to improve health and pandemic resilience? What do we need to do to build a more equitable and green future for our generations? We need to facilitate clean energy transitions and expand our region's digital transformation and access to innovative technologies. Well, we're tackling these problems that are not small by any means. We need to think of how we're going to be able to work together to facilitate safe and orderly and humane migration. The issue of misinformation, that's an issue that I've been discussing with many groups in the region. How are we, what are the structures that we have to put in place to combat disinformation? How do we increase equity and inclusion for everyone in the region? The first area, the democratic governance and strengthening that, is vital to ensure that our region's governments remain responsive to the needs of the people. When our leaders first met in 1994, they placed the strengthening of democracy and the fight against corruption at the center of their efforts. Reaffirming our dedication to democracy has been part of our leaders' commitments at each summit of the Americas, including when our leaders directed the creation of the Inter-American Democratic Charter at the 2001 summit in Quebec. This year also marks the 25th anniversary of the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, which leaders called for at the first summit in 1994. At the most recent summit in 2018, which was hosted in Peru, governments reignited global attention to the impact corruption has on democracy, governance, and economic growth in our region, and committed to efforts to counter corruption under the Lima Commitment. As we reflect upon the past 2 decades, we can celebrate, with a few exceptions, the democratic governments in the region that have delivered a period of unprecedented prosperity, security, and stability, albeit not often unequally. However, we know and we understand, and believe me, I personally, I'm extremely concerned that we still have a lot of work to be done. Right now, the citizens of our hemisphere are suffering under authoritarian regimes that are limiting their freedoms and infringing upon their human rights. Beyond the dictatorial behavior that we've seen in places like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, we know that democracy is fragile and it's under attack. The time to act and to support our people against democratic backsliding is now. Believe me, I understand that no country is immune to threats to its democracy, least of all the United States. We need to come together to demonstrate that democracy can and will deliver for our people, that participation in the civic process not only remains important, but essential to protecting our fundamental rights and essential to achieving a secure and prosperous hemisphere. Countering disinformation is a critical piece of this puzzle, both globally and in our hemisphere. As the Russian government and its proxies continue to push disinformation and propaganda, aiming to paint Ukraine and NATO as the aggressor and Russia as the victim in its premeditated, unjustified war against Ukraine, we're seeing how disinformation corrodes democracy by undermining citizens' trust in government, free and fair, independent media, and public health systems. The Russian government has reached out to its autocratic counterparts in other corners of the globe, including some of the most repressive, undemocratic actors in this hemisphere. That includes Nicaragua. I just had a conversation with a group of Nicaraguans this morning, and hearing their stories should be concerning to all of us. It includes Cuba and the repression of the Cuban people by that regime. And it includes, of course, Venezuela. Non-democratic actors in the region, such as the Maduro regime, continue to support the Kremlin's false narratives, which blame the aggression against Ukraine on NATO. Other accounts amplify pro-Kremlin disinformation on social media. And we have seen this throughout the hemisphere, in which Russia is the victim in the conflict with Ukraine. The US government is actively monitoring and addressing the Russian government and its proxies' disinformation about its war of choice in Ukraine to make sure that the world hears the truth about what is happening and counters the Kremlin's false narratives. At the summit, we will explore actionable solutions to promote resilience to disinformation across the hemisphere. The second focus area, of course, for the summit, a huge priority for all of us, it's improving health and pandemic resilience. It's going to explore COVID-19's impact so that together we can build on the lessons that we've learned so that we can improve our response and our resilience efforts. This pandemic continues to represent one of the most difficult times in our collective history. In the Americas, I want you to pay attention here. In the Americas, 2.7 million people have died. That represents more than 40% of the global death toll. More than 40% just in the Americas. This summit will promote an inclusive regional economic recovery and ensure that the economic and health consequences of the next pandemic are less severe. The third focus area, facilitating a clean energy transition, will promote regional economic prosperity by developing sustainable and accessible infrastructure to confront the climate crisis. Our region is one of the most impacted by the climate crisis in the world. I assure you that as the host of the summit, we will encourage our region's governments to commit to investing in our collective future by accelerating the transition to clean energy infrastructure. Similarly, the fourth focus area is to build a green and equitable future. It seeks to further the momentum achieved in climate summits like the UN conference in Glasgow. As the fifth and final focus area, expanding our region's digitalization and access to innovative technologies. This plays a crucial role in advancing economic prosperity. When it comes to digitalization in the Western Hemisphere, we all share similar goals, including providing digital tools and internet access to rural communities, protecting citizens' data from misuse, and promoting an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable internet. For many, and here's a fact also that I wasn't aware of, but 30% of the people living in the region do not have access to any sort of internet. So the lack of affordable, readable, accessible internet connection, we all know, limits employment opportunities. It restricts access to information for the people that people need to thrive. It limits our people's capacity to participate in critical parts of the global economy, like e-commerce. This summit offers a unique moment to put forth a compelling vision as a hemisphere for how we can use technology in a way that serves our citizens, promotes opportunity and inclusion, while protecting our privacy, and reinforces our highest democratic values. Together, I think that we can seize the opportunity of this summit by adopting a statement of shared principles to guide how we will work with other stakeholders to drive this digital transformation. Finally, and an issue that continues to come up, is the safe and orderly and humane migration. This is going to be a cross-cutting issue in all of our summit commitments. We need to look at the root causes of irregular migration. We are working with the region's governments to address these factors that are impacting migration, such as the recurring national disasters, water and food insecurity, further exacerbated by climate change, addressing the longer-term chronic challenges that are driving this migration. We're looking at, and I'm very familiar with this being from Ecuador, poverty, citizen insecurity, poor governance, corruption. We need to improve the conditions where all of us live and the opportunities in home countries so that individuals don't resort to having to leave their families behind because they have no other choice. Our summit commitments will address these root causes, our hemisphere's challenges, including failures to deliver the promise of democracy, unacceptable levels of inequality and insecurity, the devastating effects of the climate crisis, and the loss of economic opportunities are exactly what are driving people to leave their homes and their families behind, searching for better opportunities elsewhere. I am extremely excited at the summit to be able to work alongside partners from every country in the hemisphere, including government leaders, members of the civil society, also the private sector. In doing so, I know that we can harness the power of these political commitments to create a more equal and more prosperous hemisphere for all of its citizens. I invite you to continue to be engaged and continue these conversations. Please follow us. There's a LinkedIn page at Summit of the Americas where we're posting all the different events that we're having. You can register online. Follow us on Twitter, hashtag Road to the Summit, hashtag Camino a la Cumbre. So I want to hear from you. And I can tell you that for me, my priority is to bring your voices, not only to the White House and to others working in the summit, but to all the leaders of the region to understand that it is up to us to show everyone that democracy works. Thank you so much. Are you
Now,
muted?
okay,
Dr.
now
Solis?
here we go.
Oh,
Thank you very much for your presentation, Special Advisor Mucarsel-Powell. I would like to begin this conversation by asking you to elaborate a bit more. This issue of the 9th summit. Oh, you know, almost 25 years have passed since 1994. And here we are addressing some old issues and some new issues. What has changed? What has remained the same? Why is it timing and necessary to keep on having this summit?
You know, at a time, I have to tell you that hosting the summit right now, after the entire world has gone through a devastating pandemic that has affected and has also shown how vulnerable we are to our connections with one another. It's interesting that as we have seen certain leaders of different countries try to become a more, inward national focused policy, really what the pandemic has shown is that we are interconnected and that we have to work regionally to address these issues. So when you think about the past 2 years, I'll give you an example. Ecuador, of course, I always think of my home country and think of what they went through right as the pandemic was ravaging that nation in February, March of 2020. They had the highest rate of infection and the highest rate of death of COVID-19 in the entire hemisphere. It was a huge crisis. The public health infrastructure system was collapsing. There were bodies that had to be left outside of their homes. No one was picking up the bodies. And learning from the lessons of Ecuador after the pandemic, looking at how the Ecuadorian Minister of Health, and then with the incoming president, President Lasso, working closely that country with local and regional and global partners, with the World Health Organization, with countries like the United States, advice from our public health institution here, the CDC. They were able not only to bring that high rate of infection down and control the death rate, but now they are being used. Ecuador is now one of the countries that the World Health Organization has used as a global example of what it looks like to really get the COVID-19 under control. And now almost 80% of its population has had at least 2 vaccines. So those are the type of conversations that we're going to be conducting in the summit so that we can learn from each other, know how to build a more resilient public health system that will be able to prepare us for the next pandemic. That's one, but also the war in Europe. I think that the dynamics of the countries in the entire world, specifically here in the hemisphere, have changed. You're seeing a shift of geopolitical balance in Europe and here with the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. And I think it's not only a huge opportunity for us in the hemisphere to strengthen our ties, to reaffirm our commitment to democracy so that we can protect the region from aggressors like Russia. But I also think that it's an opportunity for the entire world to be united in showing the citizens that democracy works, that democracy and democratic governance is the road to economic prosperity. It's the road for continued progress. It's the way of governing so that we can actually build a sustainable future for our generations as it pertains to the climate crisis that we're all facing. So it's a critical moment. And as hosts, I think it's a huge responsibility to be able to lead the summit with the commitment to democratic governance, democratic institutions, and unity for the hemisphere.
Yeah, because when I made the question, I was thinking, certainly digitalization was not an issue 25 years ago. Climate change was an issue, but it was not framed as climate change. It was natural resources, or it was a sustainable development. The UN had just issued the Sustainable Development Index. But there are other problems like democratic governance that were clearly there. And in fact, we were all very optimistic. I had the opportunity of being here in Miami in '94 as Advisor President Figueres. And we were really hopeful that democracy would flourish everywhere. I mean, the wall had fallen and all of that. And you correctly identify democratic governance as probably the stepping stone to get into some of the other challenges that will be discussed in Los Angeles. What would you say about the state of democracy? We are seeing very complicated and worrying signs everywhere about democracy. What new things you think can be said about democracy in the summit?
I think the issue of security is critical to democracy. And it's one of the top priorities for a lot of the countries that are going to be participating in the summit. Many government representatives have said that they understand that their alliance with the United States is crucial in being able to not only provide economic opportunities for their citizens, but also to build a more secure and safe community for its citizens. We have seen, unfortunately, a rise in targeting against journalists. Many of them, including in Nicaragua, are not only being threatened, but and imprisoned, but they're also being killed. The numbers are larger for female journalists. In order for us to be able to protect democratic governance, it's extremely important to remember how crucial the free and independent press is to hold those people in power accountable so that they can report on the violation of human rights if that is happening in their home countries. And I've seen a backsliding of democratic institutions because we don't have enough good local press reporting on all of these issues. Here in the United States, the resources are lacking. We've seen a lot of small local newspapers that have been shut down because they just don't have the resources. And then other bad actors have actually taken advantage of trying to control the messages that are out there. And that's the tie-in to the misinformation. So the positive thing here is that the conversations that I've had with different governments, civil society, private sector, CEOs of companies that are small, large, medium-sized, they are all ready to sit down and work together on this. We are seeing, obviously there's some, I'm gonna be very honest here. I feel like I'm with family, but there's some games that some leaders of the region are playing right now. And it is up to us to show where we stand as it pertains to the question of democracy.
Well, that was precisely what I wanted to follow up in the next question. There's been a big discussion about the participants and three very noticeable absentees, presumably, because we have not been assured that they're not going to be. There's a discussion of whether they're going to be invited or not invited. What about that? How would you say this ought to be framed so that we understand why it is that there's been some reluctance about the presence of certain countries in the summit, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba?
Yeah, I mean, the president has been very firm, and the White House is very firm on not inviting those governments that are not going to make a commitment to democracy and democratic institutions. He is not willing to give a seat at the table to those leaders that have violated human rights. And it is truly unfortunate to see some countries trying to pressure us into making some exceptions. Personally, as a special advisor, with the experiences that I've had leaving Ecuador, understanding the corruption that is clear in Venezuela, the heightened human rights abuses by Ortega Murillo and Díaz-Canel, the lack of seriousness to the issues that are centered around the summit by any of these governments makes me personally, but I think also the administration, even more committed into strengthening the allies that we have now and making sure that the rest of the region participates, to show that if they are not willing to provide their citizens with fair and free elections, if they're not going to protect the rule of law, if they are not going to protect the freedom of press in their countries, they will miss a huge opportunity for discourse on how we build stronger trade relations, how we provide economic opportunities. A lot of the Caribbean nations, their priority is how do we build a resilient infrastructure that will resist these stronger storms because of the climate crisis. It's going to happen in June, and it will be a missed opportunity for many of the other nations. I'm not talking about the three that are probably not going to receive invitations. And I say probably because the White House ultimately decides and they send those invitations out. But the other countries will miss a great opportunity to build upon certain documents and agreements that will come out of that summit that are going to benefit their citizens.
Are you hopeful that some of the countries that have voiced their concern and some that have said that they're not coming, if not everybody's invited, do come to the summit?
I am hopeful. I don't lose hope until the last moment. I'm optimistic in that way. But there are a lot of positive conversations with the leaders of those governments from different areas. There are partners that we have in the region that are also having those conversations. So I remain hopeful.
How are you going to handle in the summit? Because it's always tricky, I must say. I mean, getting all the nations in the Americas to come and talk about issues that are they're as important as the ones that we have identified. And yet the approach to those issues is very different. Let's take energy, which is going to be one of the big issues at the summit. How are you going to be able to discuss the energy needs of countries as different as Argentina, with regards to the Central American nations, but that are close to Mexico, this providing them access to gas, and the Caribbean nations.
Well,
What do you approach to?
I mean, you look at the the issues at a macro level, and the great thing about the summit is that you're bringing the needs of these countries with the private sector so that they understand what the needs are of each and different countries so that they can actually make those investments. One of the things that I've heard from many leaders in these nations is that they don't want more money coming in. It's not that they're asking the United States or the International Development Bank for more money. What they want is innovative ways of accessing that finance so that they can actually provide for their citizens. But they also need, one of the things that I did yesterday, I was having a conversation with Mayor Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles, and he's done an incredible job of really making that transition to green energy and green technology. And he is working on hosting some of the leaders in these countries around the city to show them what he's done for the city of LA, and so that they can transfer that into their particular countries. Now, one thing to keep in mind, the summit is a launching pad. There will be many, many forums, conferences, meetings, discussions, agreements that will come after the summit. And having a conversation also with the El Banco de Desarrollo.
The IDB.
Yes.
Or CAF.
No, CAF. They are providing incredible financing opportunities and working right now with some countries to transition to green energy within the next 3 to 5 years. And they're participating and they're having those conversations with the countries also. So it's going to depend on each individual need of each nation. But I think the commitment to deforestation, to deal with the pollution that we're seeing in the oceans, to making sure that they're doing what they need to do to invest in that infrastructure. Those are the key commitments that we need from all the leaders in the region.
And are the banks willing to consider new forms? Because these countries are tremendously indebted after COVID. And,
I know.
And that is a big source of concern, not only with respects to the summit, but in general. I mean, how the future would look in Latin America without access to new credit.
You would be surprised that there are funds available. It's how do they access those funds? And those are the conversations that I'm actually having with the banks and with countries on how do we make it easier for some of these nations to be able to access funds that are already available to them.
Why don't you tell us how has been the road towards the summit? In the old days, at least when I was involved.
Do you want the real answer or the politically
the real
correct
answer? How do you frame the document? How do you because there are a number of, you've mentioned, and this is very important, this is a summit that includes not only government officials, but also representatives from civil society and the private sector, including many, many, many young people. So how do you build up the documents, and are you happy with what you see, the drafts?
The documents are extensive, you can imagine. So we have continued conversations for months now. I mean, this has been going on for at least a year and a half with the Young Americans Forum, which is under the OAS, which is working specifically on providing grants to young Americans all over the region so that they can actually participate in the summit, use grant funding to expand digitalization, to work on journalism, for example, is one that one of the students was talking about. So they incorporate all the ideas from the Young Americans Business Forum into the document. Then you have the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is leading the CEO Summit, and they're having all the discussions with the companies on what they're looking for in partnering with some of these governments. I mean, this is really revolutionary in the sense that the inclusion of all the different stakeholders has not been as seamless as it's happening right now. And that's why I'm saying, do you want the politically correct or the real? Because there's so much going on all at the same time. And there are many, many people working on this document. It hasn't been finalized. It's still being edited. Part of it is also this accord with different heads of government on migration. And how do you deal with a safe and orderly and humane migration? This is not only affecting the US border, which we think it's only here that is happening, that we're seeing these huge numbers of people coming to our border. Colombia had to welcome over 2 million Venezuelans into their country after 2019. The same thing for Peru and Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador. We're seeing now Ukrainians coming into the region. They're seeing a huge influx of Cubans and Haitians. So all the countries want to have this discussion so that we can work together and making sure that people can stay in their home country with their family with the opportunities that they need. If not, this is a huge issue that we're dealing with, not just here, but I think globally. So there's a lot going on. There are a lot of different groups working on the summit. They provide the feedback. You can all provide me with feedback. I will bring that on. And it's still a working, we have 3 weeks to go, but let me assure you that when it's something that we haven't included already, and it's something that we need to include, it's still happening. So that's why I'm here. And that's why we're having all these conversations.
I wanted to get deeper into the migration issue because well, first of all, because we do a lot of migration studies at FIU, at the LAC. At LAC, we have specialized a lot in migrations. We like to say that people don't migrate, they escape, or worse, they're kicked out of their countries by the conditions that you have outlined in your presentation, which I think was very good. It has to do with democracy, it has to do with the economy, it has to do with security. And clearly, I think it's very good that you've also mentioned that this is not only a south-north issue, that there's a lot of south-south migrations, Nicaraguans into Costa Rica, Bolivians into Argentina.
150,000 Nicaraguans into Costa Rica.
It happens throughout, and this is also true in Africa. It's also true so we should get ready to deal with migrations for a long time. This is not going to go away soon, but it requires an international understanding of the issue and multilateral solutions, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult. Now, what do you think that the summit will have enough time to provide some of those agreements that would make the life of migrants a better life?
Oh my goodness. I mean, will it all be done by June? It's not going to immediately impact the life of migrants, right? I mean, we need to be realistic. But the agreement itself has been, Secretary Blinken has been working with the countries. They had a migration meeting in Panama 2-3 weeks ago, but this wasn't the first meeting that they've had. They've been discussing this issue for quite some time. And I think that the document will be ready to be agreed upon by the summit.
Yeah, Canada has been also very active for decades now. And I think that as long as we at least identify migration as a human rights issue, also as a humanitarian issue, not only as a security issue, because the problem with migration is when it becomes securitized.
Yes.
Well,
I mean,
countries have to
it's become a political issue. And it should be a humanitarian issue. It should be an issue where we are seeing people risking their lives, traveling tens of thousands of miles because they fear that their child could die if they stay home. I mean, these are the stories that you hear over and over again. At the same time, obviously, we don't have all the resources to support this huge influx. None of these countries do, right? That's why we're having those discussions. But it's a reality, and we need to look at ways to have humanitarian immigration policies at the same time having orderly and safe policies, safety for those that are trying to flee their countries. It seems like it's becoming a weekly story that we see Cubans that are trying to come from fleeing Cuba through the Florida Straits, and they die in the process. So, I mean, it's a complicated issue that we need to set our political hat aside and work with all our regional partners so that we can protect human life. And at the same time, of course, protecting our borders, which I know a lot of Americans care about. But it's a humanitarian issue.
Thank you. I would like to make one more question, but invite also those of you who would like to address the special advisor to go to the microphones and make a line, and we would gladly take your questions in a second. One final question, Madam, what do you think is going to be the biggest challenge of the summit? You have a big panorama. You have been around working with the governments. Where do you think the bigger issues are located at this point?
I think that the biggest challenge we are going to have is to ensure that we have solid implementation of all these agreements. We can't just keep having a summit or a conference of the regional leaders without follow through, because it loses the credibility of the importance of the summit. So I think that's a priority. I think that we need to ensure implementation, follow up, making sure that we're bringing results, real results, to all the citizens in the region. At the same time, participation, ensuring that countries understand the importance of democracy, democratic institutions, and coming together to give the support to the Organization of American States. You know, this, I think, what I've seen in the past year is that the Organization of American States has slowly strengthened because of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. And I think it's another opportunity to really bring that organization as one that is going to continue to facilitate conversations from the different nations that are involved.
Thank you. I now going to give the floor to the persons who want to do a questions. I would like to remind you, nevertheless, that the special advisor is going to take questions on the summit, not on other issues that may be relevant to, you know, general policy of the United States in the region, but she's going to be dealing mostly with these other issues. I'm going to take two questions, one from each side, and then we'll go by pairs. Please, your question.
Muchísimas gracias.
Hola.
¿Cómo estás? Quería, en principio, sé que no han enviado las invitaciones, pero nuevamente el tema de Juan Guaidó, si será invitado, si se invita a Maduro, se excluye a uno u otro, dependiendo de cuál sea la decisión, y adicionalmente hablar del liderazgo de Estados Unidos, porque no solamente está este tema de México, sino que Brasil ha dicho que no necesariamente va a ir. ¿Cómo construir ese liderazgo y qué esperan de la reunión que tienen mañana en México para convencer a López Obrador, y si van a enviar también a Brasil para que todos los países puedan participar de esta cumbre?
Okay. Bueno, a ver.
Segunda, Beatriz.
Gracias, presidente. Gracias, presidente. Yo quisiera compartir con ustedes unas matemáticas muy sencillas. La última gran propuesta de políticas públicas, de la cual la Summit of the Americas era una parte, la hizo el presidente Bush Sr., y cuando él terminó su mandato había un solo país autoritario en América Latina. Para el final de la primera cumbre, con el presidente Clinton, había dos, Cuba y Venezuela. Después del presidente Bush Jr., había tres. Había cuatro. Cuba, Venezuela, Argentina y Bolivia. Con el presidente Obama había cinco. Cuba, Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia y Nicaragua. Con el presidente Trump había cinco. Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua y México. Argentina en ese momento estaba bajo un gobierno de no tendencia autoritaria. Y con el presidente Biden hay seis, que es Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, México y Argentina. Entonces, mi pregunta es, todas esas conversaciones y acuerdos que están haciendo, ¿van a ser efectivos para detener esta hemorragia autoritaria que hay en la región? Gracias.
Ya. Bueno, a ver, comencemos con lo de Guaidó. Los Estados Unidos continúan reconociendo a Juan Guaidó como el presidente interino, y lo que está haciendo la administración por pedido y conversaciones con Juan Guaidó y la oposición a Maduro es que lo que ellos quieren, lo que Juan Guaidó está pidiendo, es tener este tipo de conversaciones para llegar a unas elecciones libres que sean obviamente transparentes. Juan Guaidó definitivamente va a participar, no sé en qué capacidad, pero al final, como lo decimos, hasta que la Casa Blanca nos mande las invitaciones, no sabemos exactamente quién será invitado y quién no. La segunda parte,
Sobre Brasil, o sea, está por un lado México,
sí.
ese boicot, pero adicionalmente Brasil por otras razones.
Bueno, mira, personalmente, lo que les puedo decir en este momento es que las conversaciones diplomáticas están sucediendo diariamente. Para el presidente Biden es sumamente importante que esté ahí el presidente de México, obviamente, uno de nuestros aliados de comercio más grandes en la región, pero también porque compartimos la frontera y también porque es importante tener a López Obrador que participe para ayudarnos a que no haya una hemorragia de la democracia, como dijo la señora. Brasil es interesante. Te digo que yo pienso que pueden haber oportunidades para que Bolsonaro venga a la cumbre. Y mucho de lo que ustedes leen y ven no es exactamente lo que nos están diciendo atrás de los reportajes y de ese tipo de discursos que tienen. Pero no se sabe, o sea, no quiero garantizar nada porque no estamos teniendo esas conversaciones.
Sobre
Si va a ser efectivo. Para mí, la cumbre va a ser efectiva y vamos a tener éxito en la cumbre si tenemos la mayor parte de los países en la región que participen y podemos tener una implementación sólida. Para mí eso es crucial, porque si llegamos a acuerdos económicos que va a traer prosperidad a estos países y los países entienden que solamente los Estados Unidos, bueno, no solamente, no quiero hablar de esa manera como que somos el único país que puede dar estas oportunidades, pero que siendo aliado de los Estados Unidos podemos trabajar juntos de una manera distinta como lo que ellos han visto antes con países como China, que están tratando de penetrar la región. Y les quiero ser sinceras, muchos de estos países, sabiendo que China les está ofreciendo este tipo de inversiones, ellos prefieren 1000 veces tener las relaciones económicas con los Estados Unidos. Y hay una oportunidad para nosotros tener esas alianzas económicas. Si tenemos alianzas económicas con estos países, si ellos pueden ver un crecimiento económico en sus países, eso nos va a también ayudar a nosotros para ver un crecimiento económico aquí, en este país. Respetando las leyes y las normas democráticas son sumamente importantes, pero eso también depende de los ciudadanos de cada país, de cómo ellos eligen a sus electos. He tenido conversaciones con congresistas, asambleístas, miembros del Parlamento en otros países, y ellos entienden muy bien lo que está sucediendo y lo importante que es esta cumbre. O sea, no es solamente el presidente, también es la Asamblea, el Congreso, el Parlamento, y ellos entienden ese compromiso y estoy hablando con ellos también. Y como yo estuve en el Congreso, nos identificamos muchísimo en lo que es tener el poder en el Parlamento, en el Congreso, y lo que tenemos que hacer para tener esos chequeos y esa separación de poderes para proteger las instituciones democráticas.
Gracias. Por favor.
Madam Special Advisor, thank you very much for your presentation. President Biden has taken a significantly new approach to the global fight against corruption by developing the first national anti-corruption strategy and by categorizing corruption as a threat to national security. So my question is, what role is the anti-corruption agenda going to play in the summit, and what are the expectations in terms of concrete commitments for countries to implement following the summit? And what type of challenges do you expect to face in forging commitments in this area, given the presence of leaders that are being investigated or are part of governments with other leaders under investigation for grand corruption in the region?
Let me take another question. Alexander?
Nice to see you again, Professor, and thank you for coming, Special Advisor Mucarsel-Powell. I also wanted to ask about the invitees to the summit. And of course, I know the invitations haven't been sent out yet, but we've talked about, of course, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, but there are other states that have also seen democratic backsliding recently. You look at Guatemala, or you look at El Salvador with Nayib Bukele, who's being called their new millennial dictator. So I wanted to ask what the criteria are for the summit in determining whether a state has shown enough respect for democracy and human rights to have a seat at the table.
What a great question. He's going to be the next president, you know.
Oh, he's very good.
He's everywhere. Yeah.
He's very good. He was a nice student.
Okay, the corruption, you know, the Department of Justice has been really, really focusing a lot of its resources and its time. And I wish that all of these issues were reported more than other stuff that is not as important, but they have been working diligently in investigating corruption, particularly as it pertains to the money laundering that has been coming in here. The governments are actually asking us to have corruption as a centerpiece as we discuss democratic governance. In terms of the implementation and what's going to come of that, I don't have details on that. But it will absolutely be a centerpiece on these conversations. Many of the presidents, they have encountered a lot of corruption from government officials, especially during the pandemic, unfortunately. And of course, the narco trafficking that is going on right now in South America is really a huge threat to the security of those countries, but also to us, to our national security. Western Hemisphere Secretary Nichols has been here this week to talk and meet with the Southern Command that also is having those discussions around security and corruption. But the Department of Justice and those officials are in contact with participants on tackling corruption and investigating that. The criteria, the general criteria for a true democracy or a democratic governance is protecting the rule of law, fair and free elections, an independent judicial system, protecting the free press. Those are the minimum parameters. All the countries in 2001, when we had the Inter-American Democratic Charter, where the countries came together to show their commitment to democracy, all the nations signed that charter except for Cuba. And yes, we have seen a backsliding and we are seeing a rise of authoritarianism. Unfortunately, a lot of it, I think, is due corruption, of course, security issues, but also the rise of disinformation. In terms of Guatemala and El Salvador, I can assure you that the administration has been watching what is going on. They're paying attention, but at this time, I don't see how they would be excluded right now.
Adam, you're going to be the last question, so have 2 minutes.
Perfect. I'll keep it brief. You've already mentioned that one of the biggest problems is going to be follow through. What concrete steps can be taken to make sure that the summit serves, as you said, as a launching pad rather than the United States and other countries in the region being distracted by other crises of the moment?
There's an entire office that is dedicated to ensuring that there will be follow-up and follow-through, and there are already conversations on having meetings outside of the summit, following the summit. For example, one of the things that I'm actually really excited about, if I can share, is having the mayors of major metropolitan cities all over the Americas meet together, because a lot of these changes really happen locally at the ground level, so that they can follow up on the commitments from the summit, so that they know what financing is available, so that they can talk about the issues that are affecting them the most. So we're already having those conversations on follow-up. But it's going to be up to the entire team, the summit team, to be diligent on providing the support and allowing for those conversations to happen so that we can solidify the results of the summit.
That's an interesting one, the mayor.
Isn't that fun?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Professor Fonseca, we couldn't leave here without your question, sir.
Last question, and I was reluctant, since we have time, I'm going to ask a provocative question that's probably going to take 20 minutes to answer. No, I'm kidding. So we've seen announcements this week of U.S. sort of policy shifts towards Cuba. There's a percolating, announcement moving around the media now about sort of relieving of sanctions in Venezuela. And I recall back in December, ahead of the 7th summit in Panama, there was a thawing of relations with Cuba. Part of the design, at least some argued, was to increase the space to communicate during the actual summit. Is there any of that happening here, in which some of the shifts in policy towards Venezuela and Cuba are designed to create more space for dialogue at this summit? Or is it just, coincidence that it's sort of occurring on the edges of the summit?
Well, let me speak to one part of this Cuban policy shift, the Cuban Family Reunification Parole Program. I can tell you that for me personally, this was an issue that I worked on when I was in Congress, and I have continued to speak with Cuban families even after, and this has been a huge request by Cuban families for quite some time. They have been slowly staffing the U.S. Embassy in Cuba. I have been speaking with different members of the State Department and other officials to expedite the reopening of the parole program. I was extremely excited when it finally was announced yesterday. It's giving tens of thousands of Cuban families the opportunity to be reunited. I think partly it's a coincidence. I think that because of the Ukraine war, it shifted the focus a little bit from the administration and now coming back to, really working on these issues in the region. Now, it does not lift any sanctions in Cuba, absolutely not. The administration hasn't changed its position on really making sure that that regime is accountable for its human rights violations, and they're having very serious discussions on the freedom of political prisoners. The same thing for Venezuela. The discussions that have been had with the opposition is that what they've been asking for and what they've been trying to do for a while, for a few years, is sit down at the table so that they can have free, transparent elections. It's very difficult to have transparent elections under the Maduro narco regime, which is an illegitimate regime. So there are a lot of conversations around what that looks like, but it is Juan Guaido and the opposition that have expressed the desire to sit at the table so that they can get to a place where they can give that opportunity to Venezuelans. In terms of sanctions, the announcement just came out today, so I don't have the details, but it's not that they're lifting sanctions. It's that if the Maduro regime sits at the table with Guaido to get to that place, certain companies will have the opportunity to talk to Venezuela about how they can work together. But it hasn't really repealed any sanctions. Unfortunately, those headlines are they can be hurtful and misleading. And it's interesting when you know everything that's going on behind the scenes and then you see the headline, you're like, okay, that doesn't connect, but we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens.
Thank you, Madam Special Advisor. Please join me in a round of applause for Madam Special Advisor to the President.
Thank you.